Hello and welcome to the Unit 4 Part 2 presentation for EDSE 673. In this unit, and particularly in this presentation, we will be focusing on the concept of consolidating and expanding our knowledge of practice and our knowledge of evidence-based practice through research. So key questions to think about as we work through this content are: how do we decide which practices we will adopt and how will this play out? So we want to keep in mind the cake analysis, the fact that there are many different ingredients that might go into the success of an intervention, and this success would be measured by meeting the set goal, which would go up in the corner there on the cake analysis. Keep in mind that implementation of an intervention occurs along a timeline. So we want to think about first the advanced planning, and that references the idea of looking ahead. Really includes the research process, talking around and asking other people in the field and practitioners that you trust about practices that have worked for them, and then more formal research, going through meta-analysis documents, journal articles, reviewing those What Works websites, and synthesizing the results of all of that research to identify what practice or what intervention you will be implementing in your setting. After you begin implementation, you'll want to move forward with in-process planning, and that involves monitoring the effectiveness of the intervention as you are doing it. So we discussed some more advanced forms of research, or some different detailed types of research. You can also use action research, which is when you yourself are researching within your setting to determine what's working and how and why or why not. Then after implementation planning, that's the idea of evaluation. That's the program evaluation component, which we will discuss also in this session. And this involves the idea of adjusting our practices or our implementation of the intervention as needed. And ultimately, if we're identifying that the intervention we've implemented is not working at all, we'll want to go back to the drawing board and move into this advanced planning stage to see what else might be effective. Keep in mind, as we're looking at the idea of composition, or different factors that make up the ultimate cake that is our setting and the attempt for our intervention. Here's an example, just to review the concept of the cake model again. If we're looking at the idea of homework, and we see here in red we've got homework, we want to think about which factors might go into the completion and effectiveness of homework. See here in our cake, we have ideas like feedback that students receive on work, whether family supports a consistent, calm study space, whether students are motivated, etc. So keep in mind with these cake models, we're looking at elements that combine to produce a positive result or conditions, and these conditions which facilitate the occurrence of our desired outcome. So if we've got a goal up here, which is skill development through homework as measured by X, Y, or Z. We're looking at these many things which play into the successful completion and the helpfulness, really, of the homework. We have a concept that we're going to look into based on this idea of the cake model called the INUS Condition. So INUS, I-N-U-S, stands for insufficient but necessary part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. And that's a mouthful, but we'll talk through what it means. Really here at the bottom is a phrase that might be helpful, this sentence. There are ingredients that may affect what we want, but they're not the only ingredients that will affect what we want. To break this down further, we're looking at the idea that there is not any one set recipe to reach a goal or to make an intervention successful, but that there are certain factors when combined together that will create that condition of success. Keep in mind that the cake must be sufficient or enough to reach that positive contribution or the meeting of that goal. For instance, that goal might be improving reading scores or reducing occurrences for a problem behavior. But the pieces or the slices in the cake are not necessary, in the sense that there are many other ways that the cake could be conceptualized or created, many other ingredients that could go into this cake to achieve the same results. We'll have a few visuals as examples here. the main idea is that there are many different cakes that can get us to the result that we're looking for. Your particular cake is only one of them, but what will make up your cake is based on the resources and the access that you have to the things around you. So keep in mind that your condition that you're creating with your cake is not necessary, as in it's not the only one that could possibly reach your goal. But if your cake is created correctly, it will be sufficient to reach your goal. And each ingredient within that sufficient cake will be insufficient by itself and insufficient for some other cakes, but necessary for the cake that is sufficient, the cake that you have created that is working. So, some examples here. If we're looking at academics and we're trying to achieve progress in general education curriculum for students, you'll see we have two different cake models. If reading is our particular goal, and you'll see that these are different. Some of them are repeated. We've got some variety here. For instance, pull aside or pull out instruction is included here, but we don't have it here. So we might say, for instance, in a given situation, that this cake model and this cake model both worked. So reviewing the concept of INUS, we can say, each of these by itself is not necessarily sufficient, but altogether it is sufficient to create a model that does work. Not the only model, but a model that could work, one of the many models, and the same for this model. However, we may not get there. We may not get to that sufficient condition. So for instance, let's say that these combinations are actually not effective to reach grade level reading comprehension. And we could talk through each part, but for the sake of example, let's consider the possibility that all of these adding up together will not realize this goal. We will not get there using these. Okay, so this quote right here is a bit lengthy, a bit complex, but it's summarized down here at the bottom to put it into different words. The idea is that evidence-based practices are compromised or they don't work when the long-term outcomes are not taken into consideration in the equation, or the practices are used with contraindicated practices, and those would be practices that we should not use in a given scenario. So the way that I would summarize that as I'm considering these topics is that we need the right ingredients or we won't get what we want. If we're trying to make carrot cake, but we use ingredients for brownies, we're not going to get what we are looking for. We don't have to have any one specific ingredient, although in carrot cake, carrots would be probably essential. But in the cake model here for education or for service provision and for practice, we don't have to have necessarily any one specific ingredient, but we do need the right ones all together. That's the idea of the INUS condition. We'll use a metaphor here for what we call advanced planning, and that is really just looking at an intervention and doing that research to try to put it into place and then taking a look at how it's going. So thinking about art, particularly thinking about painting or watercolor, as we'll discuss, we need to take into consideration composition, rendering, perspective, and reflection as we're working with a particular selected intervention, and we'll go through that in each upcoming slide. So thinking about art, it's kind of fun to draw this connection using this metaphor if art is something that you're interested in. Looking at the idea of composition. Composition in art involves, answering the question, what will I put into my picture? What images will I include and what materials might I use? What will I not include? So for instance, if you're painting from a photo and you take a picture like this, then you might have, some kind of animal or another person over here that you don't want to include in your painting. You can leave that one aside, or maybe this boat was not here, but you want to insert it anyway. And that's where that creative license comes in. So we want to think about what can we, which ingredients can we adjust, or what ingredients are we choosing in the first place? What are the elements and what are their relationships to one another? And to do that mindfully. Next, we have the idea of rendering, which in art is going to, lead us to thinking about personal touch and how we might modify something How might we create our product based on the resources that we have or the grants from which we are working? So in practice, this would look like applying the intervention of your choice or whatever you're implementing to your program, your school, your setting. Which paintbrushes will you use? So how will you do it? You want to have that personal touch, looking at context, very important. And you'll take something that is unbiased or objective from the evidence, as much as it can be, and then put it into your setting, and that will create some bias or some subjectivity. Taking a look at the idea of replication, replicating standards in the research and in the literature with fidelity. It may not be possible for us to do exactly what we're instructed to do, and it may not be possible for us to ensure that everybody involved, all the stakeholders, are doing it the same way every time, across time. But because this cannot be done perfectly, we are looking more for what we call integrity in implementation, trying to do the absolute best to implement based on the needs that we know that our program has and to hit the main ideas and try to do this right and to do this with consistency, taking natural variation into consideration. Next, we're looking at perspective. Perspective in art, as we're thinking about the big picture, where are we looking from? What kinds of things are we seeing and how are we seeing them? There's a list here of many different interventions and things that could be put into place. But as we're doing any one of these or a different one that's not on this list, we want to think about our short-term, our intermediate, and our long-term outcomes. If we're just choosing or doing one of these or something else without really keeping that perspective and knowing to which port we are sailing, we're not going to get where we're trying to go. So remember, as we're implementing whatever intervention we choose, we want to keep all of our outcomes in mind, and that's where the logic model comes in. Finally, we're looking at the process of reflection, and reflection is all about setting aside our work. You may do this if you've painted or if you've done some drawing and you start looking at it too much, and you might really kind of lose that ability to step back. So you have to walk away and then at a different time return and reflect on the art that you have done. So at that point, you'll evaluate and say, what I'm doing is working, or perhaps I need to make some adjustments. And this is where program evaluation comes into play. You want to look at things across time and really, identify whether what you're doing is working or whether there are some changes that need to be made, or perhaps something different that needs to be done altogether. This is a good place to insert the idea of reflective teaching. Two different kinds of problem solving. For instance, consider a behavior. Let's say it occurs in the hallway. We have a problem. We want to first stop and after the intervention has been completed and the issue is taken care of, we want to describe and characterize what occurred. Look at all the factors, what peers perhaps, what staff members were involved, who was present or contributing, and what could have been done differently, if anything, what would have been more effective in the situation. So to learn from that situation right on the spot in the moment. And ultimately, we're looking at the table problem solving. This could be in the instance of a meeting, something more formal, or some kind of planning project with the team and with stakeholders, which is formal and long-term in nature. So we're looking always at vision for the student or for the client, long-term goals, strategies that have been in place to promote success, and ultimately, again, we're coming down to that question of what can we do differently to be more effective. So keep in mind, really just like an art project, all of these components are very important for program evaluation, both in the short term and in the long term, as well as in intermediate.